Jack, your accomplishments, of course, you run out of adjectives. But let's talk about turning points. Is there a single turning point in your career that stands out above all the rest?
It was after I had begun practicing law and finding out that law was interesting, but nowhere in the world, in the United States, was there an entrepreneurial kind of economy. And therefore, there was nowhere that I was seeing things that were, I felt, worth getting into. I had spent some time as a litigator, and I had spent some time with the government, and I had spent some time as a tax lawyer and some time as an SEC lawyer, and I was looking for something interesting to do. And I was kind of despairing of it because it wasn't all that interesting. All they had in this country, and actually in the world as a whole, was big corporations and little bitty businesses like restaurants and cleaners and local businesses. And there was nothing else very entrepreneurial anywhere. And sort of in my mind, I visualized back, and I think I saw lightning bolts kind of go across the sky. And that later on, I kind of visualized it. And it said, this is the beginning of the venture capital private equity era. And I had the opportunity to get involved with one of the earlier risk equity investing transactions. A bank formed a small unit to make $250,000 investments in new or startup companies to see if they could get some equity profits instead of just interest on their money. And they wanted to have an outside counsel rather than their general counsel represent it, and they called Kirkland & Ellis and asked to send their best risk investing lawyer. And so Kirkland & Ellis, I'm told later, kind of looked around and said, who's our best risk investing lawyer? And nobody had any idea what risk investing was. No one did. And so someone around the firm who I worked for said, well, why don't you send Levine? Perhaps he can figure out what it is. He doesn't know much about anything. But he knows a little bit about a lot of things. You know, he was a CPA, and then he went to Harvard Law School, and then he was a law clerk in the Second Circuit, and then he came to Kirkland as a litigator for several years, and then he went to the Solicitor General's office, and he argued a bunch of cases. Then he came here, and he decided to become a tax lawyer because he was tired of litigation, and then he got tired with that, and he became a SEC lawyer. And he's thinking of leaving the practice of law because he's not finding anything really interesting to do. So why don't you send him? So they sent me. They didn't tell me that at the time, what it was. I went there, and I sat in on this transaction that was being negotiated, and it was a $250,000 investment in this small startup company. And afterwards, the guy who was in charge of the risk investing unit, about a 35-year-old banker, I said to him at lunch break when we left to talk about it, and I said to him something like, I don't understand what you're talking about. You haven't asked any of the relevant questions yet about due diligence and reps and warranties and covenants and the kind of securities we'd get and the tax ramifications and the SEC ramifications and what we'd file and where. And I said, in the draft documents you gave me from your law department doesn't say anything about any of that. It's just like a form lease where you fill in the blanks of the names and the amount you're going to invest and so forth. And he said, oh, well, okay, when we go back in after lunch, why don't you ask the questions? So for the first time, instead of reporting to assistant general counsels of big companies and having them not want any ideas from me, he was asking for ideas. And so I began cross-examining and talking and asking questions. And so 5 or 6 hours later, when we broke, and they were going to come back the next morning at 9 to sign the documents because they were going to catch a plane out at 11, he said to me, Jack, I don't understand. How are we, it's now 6 o'clock at night, how are we going to have a contract to sign tomorrow when you told me that this leasy-looking thing, a long piece of paper with blanks in it, is not adequate? I said, Stanley, that's my problem, that's not your problem. So I whipped back to the office, had my secretary stay over. We stayed up all night. I wrote a 30-page contract, came back the next morning, we signed that up. 6 months later, the company was bankrupt. But in the meantime, he said to me, I want you to represent me in all my transactions. Would you do that? And I said, well, this is the first interesting thing I've ever done in the practice of law. Yeah, I think that would be really nice. So I started to represent him. And then there was another risk investing unit that he introduced me to. I started representing them as well. And then KKR was going to form a private equity fund in New York, and Stan Golder's bank was going to be one of the backers for it. So they asked me to be the counsel for the limited partners in this first ever formed private equity fund. Not a bank holding company, not an insurance company with money putting into risk investing. We began to call that venture capital. So we negotiated the terms. We talked about, 2 and 20, how we'd draft the documents, what you would call it. We'll call it a fund. So I was one of the lawyers that was involved in that. That went very well. And then 6 or so months later, Stan Golder, who was my person at the First National Bank of Chicago, he said to me, Jack, I love being at the First National Bank of Chicago. I do great. I'm making $35,000 a year, and I get a turkey at Thanksgiving, and it's wonderful. It's not an entrepreneurial world, but it's great. But what would you think if I went and tried to form one of these little venture capital things? Do you think you could help me with that? I said, I think I could. I think I've got enough experience in it to do it now. So we formed it, and it was the second venture capital fund.
Now, when this was all going on, this turning point, how many lawyers were at Kirkland?
Well, when I joined Kirkland, there were about 60 lawyers, of whom about 10% were transactional, 90% were litigation. By this time, by the time that we had done these risk investing transactions, we had probably grown to maybe, I'm going to guess, 100 lawyers at that point.
But still predominantly litigation.
Yeah, 90% litigation. Mm-hmm.
So when we come back and talk about this turning point in a little more detail in a little bit, the context is set that you began this pathway that has continued to this day. And just as
When you say I began it, let me tell you, my view of it is that God caused me to be born at just the right time, so that as I reached law school and then law clerking and so forth, in this very dull, non-entrepreneurial economy that we had in the whole world, not just the US, the whole world, that I would be around and I would see the lightning bolt when it came across the sky, and that I would be able to be one of the many who helped to start this, what I thought was going to be a small growth industry in the US. And what became, amazingly, is a worldwide,
yes.
I mean, not just in the US, but in Europe, in Asia, in South America, pretty much all over the world. There's now what was first venture capital. First was risk investing, and then it was called venture capital, and then it was private equity, and then it was leveraged buyouts, and then it was fund formations as you form funds, and there are now thousands of funds. And then companies began to go bankrupt that we invested in, so we formed a small bankruptcy group. I pushed the firm to hire a bankruptcy lawyer. We hired one. Now we have like 300 bankruptcy lawyers all over the world. And we saw the entrepreneurial economy grow to where we birthed the companies. We helped to grow the companies. If they got in trouble, we handled the bankruptcy. And my view is that I was lucky enough to be born at exactly the right time to be there.
Yes.
And it wasn't me who chose to be born then. It was God. He put me there to play a small role in this, and I'm thankful for that.
Well, we'll come back to the subject. When you entered Harvard in the fall of 1958, Harvard Law School, we all get our impressions of Harvard, particularly of that era, from Paper Chase. I watched it again the other evening just to get refreshed. And I've got to ask, how close to reality was Paper Chase for you as a beginning first year at Harvard?
It was 100%. The man, the professor on whom Paper Chase was based was my professor in the first class I took. The first class I walked into at Harvard was a class in property law. Whatever property law is, I don't remember. Property law. Today we don't even talk about property law. And it was in property law. And he was a very formal person who called on you, and he asked you to recite a case and to explain something, and he would dialogue with, and if you got it wrong, he would say, leave the room. Leave the room. So I was sitting there. It was a class of 550 students in the school, and it was divided into three sections, so that was 170 sections.
Now, you
and
came from...
Scared to death. I mean, what if he called on me? What would I do?
Now, you were valedictorian of Northwestern University class, so you were not shabby. But what kind of reaction were you getting from your fellow classmates at the beginning from all the people who were around you?
Well, first of all, I have to say, they were wonderful people. They were the smartest people you ever met. So it was a class of 550, and I can remember sitting around in the lunchroom early on in you're meeting people and you're talking to people. I remember somebody saying to me, everybody was kind of jabbing a little, and the guy said to me, I don't understand. You went to a second-rate Midwest business school, and you expect to come here to Harvard and make it in this class? I mean, this person over here was first in his or her class at Harvard undergrad. This one over here won the national debate championship from Dartmouth, a team from Dartmouth, and on and on and on and on. So I was kind of cowed at the time. All that did is make me study harder, and I was lucky I had gotten married 2 weeks before I started Harvard Law School. We did a 2-week honeymoon, and went directly then from there to Harvard Law School. And so I had nothing to do but study while my wife was teaching high school in Boston. And
so they were giving you the business.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
All right, so let's...
It was all, in the end, it turned out to be all good-natured. I mean, these are people that I love.
There's a little elitism going on here. All right, so how were you graded in your first year? How did you get tested? What was the process?
Oh, it was tantamount to being in prison, in the sense that you studied day and night. You went an entire year from September to May without ever having an exam that counted. No exams. And then at the end, you had, I think it was 6 exams in the 6 courses that you had taken over the year. And each exam was roughly 2 to 4 hours long.
How did you get your grades?
How
did you get your grades?
Well, first of all, it took a month and a half to 2 months into the summer. I was back in Chicago working for an accounting firm. They had been kind enough because I won the CPA gold medal, and they thought maybe they'd get me to go into accounting. And it was a month and a half, and I was in panic the whole time to see whether I flunked out or not. And so what arrived in the mail one day was an envelope. It was a postcard that flipped over, and there was a little piece of tape on it. So I looked at it, and I flipped it over to see what, and nowhere in there did it say anything about grades or anything. It just had my name and so I called, and I said, where do I look to see what it says? And they said, well, over on the upper left, do you see that square? And I said, yes. And they said, well, there's a number in that square. And I said, yeah, but what does it tell me about my grades? They said, well, what's the number in yours? I said, 1. It's nothing but a 1. And they said, well, that means you're first in the class. I said, in what class? And they said,
So I guess the guys stopped punching you in the chest after that, huh? All right, so second,
no, they just hit twice as hard.
all right, so went on to Harvard Law Review as a second year.
Yep.
The first 25 students get invited.
At that point, there was no writing to get on,
It was just pure grades.
just pure grades of the top.
So second
5%.
grade, and you were working under the third years, who were the editors.
Absolutely.
And so you write very well today. Reading any of your material is striking how well you write. But what was the process of you learning how to write on the Harvard Law Review?
Well, the third-year students on the Harvard Law Review, they oversaw and supervised the second-year students who did the initial writing, and then they did the editing. And I would tell you that any skill I have today in writing came from those.
Was there anyone in particular who supervised you?
Well, there were several. One of them that was most impressive was a guy named Nino Scalia, Antonin Scalia, who later became a Supreme Court justice, as you may recall. Now, Nino Scalia, when he was on the Supreme Court, was always viewed as a very straight arrow kind of guy. No joy to it. The fact is, he was the sweetest, nicest, most friendly guy in the whole world, cutting jokes every minute, and a great advocate and teacher on the Law Review.
So,
and then there was one other that was very notable, and he later went on to become a Harvard Law School professor, and that's what he spent his life doing.
all right, so in your third year, you became an editor. Here is the masthead of the Harvard Law Review when you were case editor in 1960-61 period. What was the workload like to do classwork and this at the same time?
Well, in the second year, when I was on the Harvard Law Review as a second year, I not only had to work 40 hours on the Harvard Law Review a week, it was required 40 hours, you had to sign in and sign out during the course of a week, but I had to study and try to maintain those grades. And luckily, I did succeed and was again first in the class the next year, but it was an immense amount. My wife and I would probably talk 30 minutes a week. We'd have dinner together briefly, and then
on this masthead,
the third year, when I was a member of the upper part of the Harvard Law Review, he maybe only put in 35 hours a week instead of 40 hours. So it was sort of like easy going.
so you had Mr. Scalia as your supervisor as a third year. Look at some of the names on this list. Right under you is Jerry Cohen.
Nathan Gerald Cohen, later to be chief counsel of the IRS, one of my closest friends.
Over on the right, you see Richard Posner, Seventh Circuit. Daniel Halpern. He, of course, was crowding you, I'm told, a little bit. He wanted to be number one himself, but you were in that spot.
Danny Halpern, who became a professor at Harvard Law School, was second in the class at Harvard Law School. So we had a little bit of a thing going.
And then Jerry McGaffey. So some tax lawyers.
Jerry D. McGaffey, great tax lawyer.
So it's funny that y'all stayed tax orientated all this time. That's
absolutely. So I guess I have to say here that this was another amazing thing, that on this group of like 25 people in my class or on the Harvard Law Review, there were so many people who went on to be notables in the tax area, U.S. tax area, and they were superstars.
All right, so you had a third-year paper. Everybody wrote a paper in their third year.
Yes.
And how did it come to pass that you wrote a paper? What is the story on that?
Well, in my third year, I took the most sought-after sought-after seminar class that was available, and it was a tax class taught by Professor Ernest Brown, who was a famous tax professor, along with Stanley Surrey. The two were the great stars there. And they only took into that seminar like 12 people, and most of them were on the law review. And yes, I wrote a paper, and Professor Brown told me, I was trying to think of a topic, and he said, you don't have to think of a topic. I'll tell you the topic I wanted you to write. Oh, okay. So I wrote the paper on the case for a stepped-up basis for the transferee in certain reorganizations. And so that was his pet peeve. So I wrote this paper, and my wife typed it. I couldn't typed it, and he liked it so much that he had it published.
So it was the third year. Being published in Tax Law Review is pretty awesome. Yeah. That is the first page. All right. So then you went to work for the Chief Judge of the Second Circuit, and time doesn't permit to elaborate. Just that was an experience for 1 year.
I first went to Kirkland and Ellis for the summer after my third year. Got my feet wet in the practice of law. Then went to New York.
To New York for the Second Circuit.
Second Circuit.
And then you came back to Kirkland after the clerkship and started in litigation.
Yes, my judge, the Chief Judge of the Second Circuit, told me, tax is interesting, but you don't want to do that. You want to get into litigation. So he gave me a pep talk. So I decided when I got to Kirkland, I'd be a litigator.
So when you look over Westlaw of your cases during that time that have your name on it, they're big, massive class actions and antitrust cases and all the rest. All right, so jumping forward, you're percolating.
And I was playing a very junior role.
Yes.
Writing briefs and assisting in depositions, right. Not even yet taking depositions.
All right, so then you get a phone call one day in 1965.
3 years into the
So what happened, and who was it, and how did it affect your life?
The phone rang one day. I picked it up, and the voice said, Jack, this is Archibald Cox. And I said, Professor Cox. He had been a professor at Harvard Law School. Later, you may recall him as that he went on to be the special counsel that indicted Richard Nixon, investigated and indicted Richard. But that was years later. So I said, Professor Cox. And he said, well, I'm not a professor right now. I am the Solicitor General of the United States. I was just appointed. And I would like you to come to Washington and become Assistant to the Solicitor General for tax matters. He said, because I remember when you were at Harvard Law School, they talked about you as being the guy who took all the tax courses and did rather well. So I said, oh my, what an opportunity. So I went home, and I said to my wife, Sandy, who at that point we had 2 small children. One was 3 months old, and one was about 3 years old. And I said to her that night when I walked in the door, first thing I said was, Sandy, I've got some really good news for you. And she said, what? And I said, well, in 2 weeks from today, a big moving van is going to come here. And they're going to pick up all our furniture, and we're going to move to Washington, D.C. And I don't remember the exact words she said, but I think they said something like, listen, Charlie, if you're moving to Washington, D.C., you're doing it by yourself. Because I got these 2 screaming daughters here, and I've got not capable of taking charge of all this. I've got 2 mothers here, my mother and your mother. And they come and they babysit and they help me. So I'll see you later.
You persuaded her.
2 weeks later, the moving van came. We loaded up the moving van. We put on the furniture. We went to Washington, D.C. We found an apartment. We rented it. And we were then in Washington, D.C. for a little over 2 years.
All right. So you served under 2 Solicitor Generals.
2 wonderful solicitors.
Professor Cox and then Thurgood Marshall, of course.
Amazing people.
He had been on the Second Circuit when you clerked there?
Yes, I had known him just that much when I clerked.
Right, and then, of course, he went to the Supreme Court after that. And then this is the Supreme Court when you were there, and the only difference in these 2 pictures is Arthur Goldberg is on the left. He left. And then Abe Fortas is top right. He came on while you were there. All right. Now, what was the staffing at the Supreme Court? Who did you answer to? I mean, who was your supervisor?
At the Supreme Court?
Yes.
Oh, it was the Solicitor General.
Himself.
Himself.
And did you have any juniors under you?
No.
It was you and your secretary.
Yes. Well, there were roughly 8 or 9 assistants to the Solicitor General, and I was one of those.
But you were the brief writer? Did you write your own briefs?
Yes. When I was assigned a case, I might, oppose certiorari, seek certiorari. If the case was taken, write the briefs.
And make the argument.
And make the arguments if assigned, and I usually was assigned to make the arguments, yes.
So when you look at the timing of your arguments, again, you're 29 years old when you arrived. So Freiburg, your first case, you argued in November 65. Tellier, an important tax case, 2 months later, Millott versus Riddle. Of course, a famous tax case we all studied in school. March 66, 2 months later, Cato, same month, end of the month, another case, and then, of course, the state of Bosch, March of 67. Anybody who has a Supreme Court case will spend months and months and months getting ready. You're blowing through them like it's going to the grocery store. How can you do this? You're 29 years old. This is a big deal.
Well, as a matter of fact, being at the Solicitor General's office, as opposed to being at Kirkland and Ellis where I was, used to working like 17 hours a day, 6.5 days a week, this was kind of like a walk in the breeze. I mean, the Solicitor General's office in the government is pretty much a 9-to-5 operation, 5 days a week. So since all this didn't keep me busy, I went to since I had a little bit of tax experience, I went to the Assistant Attorney General in charge of the tax division, who I worked with on the cases that were coming up to the Supreme Court. And I said, hey, would there be any chance that I could get some cases out on the circuit courts to argue? And he said, yeah, you do a good job on these things.
And so these are the cases you started arguing in all the circuits around the country. And because you didn't have enough to do with your Supreme Court arguments every couple of months, you realize you're blowing my mind, I'd have to tell you this. So then what's this district court in Maine? What's that about?
Oh my God, that was wonderful. So I got to argue cases in the circuit courts all over the country. And then I said, would you want me to try a case in the district court? And he said, yes. We've got a couple of really complicated transactional cases. So they assigned me to 2 cases that ultimately ended up in Maine in the district court before a judge who had been a Harvard law graduate and a very intelligent, very able person. And so what would happen is the cases were all prepared, depositions taken, and I would fly in the night before, meet with the U.S. attorney, read all the depositions that had been taken, read whatever briefs had been filed, and then I would cross-examine witnesses and call witnesses and argue the case. And actually, there was really a kind of an interesting incident in one of the cases. So I'm up there cross-examining a witness, and he's answering something, and I disagreed with him and explained to him why that was wrong and cross-examined him some more. And the judge said to me, how is this relevant? And I said, well, Your Honor, I'm glad you asked that question. So this is tall, good-looking Harvard law guy, and he's looking at me and questioning me. And I said, I'm glad you asked that question because this is key to a certain section in the Internal Revenue Code. And I began to recite the section of the Internal Revenue Code and explain how it was relevant. So I was making a legal argument to the judge, and then he said, okay, go ahead, cross-examine. So I cross-examined more on it. And then he leaned over and he said to me, Mr. Levine, have you ever considered code section, I'm not sure what he said, 394 or something like that? And I said, code section 394, Your Honor? And I reached over and I grabbed the code and I flipped through it. I said, Your Honor, there is no code section 394. And he said, I just wanted to see if you knew that.
All right. So this is back to your timeline.
And I guess the last point is, then they were nice enough at the tax division to give me a week-long jury trial. So I flew in and interviewed witnesses and things, and then participated in a week-long jury trial.
I'm having a little trouble you walking up to the Department of Justice and saying, I don't have enough to do. All right, let's move on. Who is Stanley Golder?
Stanley C. Golder. Well, Stanley C. Golder is the key to how I moved on from being a litigator and then a Solicitor General's office person and then a tax lawyer when I came back to Kirkland. So I came back to Kirkland and I was a tax lawyer for 3 years, and it was wonderful. We had a tax department of about 3 lawyers, and maybe it had grown to 4. And then I got kind of bored with tax law, and so I
You have a low boredom threshold, I want to tell you.
yeah. So I did until I got to the private equity venture capital industry, and then it was overwhelming. But so I decided I was tired of being a tax lawyer, so I said at Kirkland, I want to go into the SEC and public offering area. So they transferred me over to a three-person group that was doing public offerings for Goldman Sachs and filing things with the SEC. And so I had done that for about 2 years, and that got really boring too.
Of course it did.
And then that lightning bolt across the sky I told you about, it happened, but I didn't notice it quite at that time. What happened was that there was nothing going on entrepreneurial anywhere in the world, as I mentioned earlier, nothing going on. And then something that I didn't even know about had begun. There were several institutions that had formed small risk investing units, as I may have mentioned. And Stanley C. Golder was the head of one of those in Chicago, the First National Bank of Chicago's risk investing unit.
But you could make a case that he might be the most significant guy that changed your career.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And so he died early in his life, but he was one of the early pioneers of
one of my 2 or 3 closest friends in my life.
All right, we're going to get to Mr. Ginsburg right now. Okay, so you're acquiring KKR and all these companies, and your business is growing. How did you start into the Martin Ginsburg world? How did you meet him and he you?
It was just another absolute miracle. I was in the right place at the right time. A Harvard Law School classmate of mine who lived in Hawaii called me one day and said, we have a great tax institute here. Now, he thought I was still practicing tax law. I really wasn't. I had moved over a little bit. But he said, we have a great tax institute here called the Hawaii Tax Institute. Now, it's not as good as the Texas Tax Institute, but it's a good one, the Hawaii Tax Institute. And they get about 400 people a year who fly in there, spend 5 days at the Hawaii Tax Institute, and then they go off to the islands. So it's a very attractive space. I will tell you, Texas is equally beautiful to Hawaii. Looking out that window is an amazing thing. And so he said, will you come speak at the Hawaii Tax Institute? I said, what do I get? He said, well, you get 2 coach tickets if you want to bring your wife or a first class. I said, I'll bring my wife, okay. And he said, we'll give you a hotel room for 3 days, and you can see. I said, okay. I said, good, I'll do that. And he said, okay, you'll be speaking with this other guy. And I said, oh, who's that? He said, his name is Martin D. Ginsburg. And I said, well, I don't know him, but that's fine. I'll be happy to speak with anyone. He speaks English, right? And he said, yes, he does. Okay. So they said, you'll speak on 3 topics, and it'll be for 2.5 hours. 2.5 hours? Yeah, 3 topics. So I was waiting for Martin D. Ginsburg, who was my senior. He was like 3 years ahead of me at Harvard Law School, and 4 years, I think, ahead of me at Harvard Law School, so I didn't know him. But I was waiting for him to call, because he was my senior, and say, how do you want to arrange this? But he never called. He's a very confident person, and he was deserved to be very confident because he was very capable. And so he never called. So I studied the topics, and when I got there, and the speech was to begin at 9 a.m., I'm sorry, at 8 a.m., and I arrive, and I'm standing down there, and there's this big room full of people, and it's 3 minutes to 9, and I look up on the stage, and standing off to the side, way over there, is a nice-looking guy. So I go up the stairway, and I say to him, excuse me, are you Martin Ginsburg? And he said, yes. And I said, I'm Jack Levine. He said, nice to meet you. And I said, look, I just want to ask you a question. We're going to sit down in these 2 chairs with a microphone between us. Tell me, how do you want to do this? Do you want me to speak on the first topic, and then you speak on the second topic, and then we'll split the third topic? And he said, no. And then there was silence, and I said, well, how did you think we would do it? He said, well, why don't you start talking? And if I think of anything I want to say, I'll interrupt. So I waited for him to say some more, and he didn't. So I said, let me see if I got this straight. Just let me see if I got this straight. I start talking. You don't think of anything you want to say, and then 2.5 hours later, we get up and leave the stage. Is that? And he looked at me and he said, you know, you're a lot brighter than you look. So that was my first experience. So I was a little nervous. So I sat down, and indeed, just exactly like this, I was in the left-hand chair and he was in the right. So I began with it. Now, each of these 3 topics were topics not about necessarily mergers and acquisitions. They were about real estate deals and other kinds of transactions. I hadn't gotten that much into mergers and acquisitions yet. And so the first topic had to do with this complex real estate transaction. And I explained how I would do this transaction. Now, I was going to say each of the 3 transactions were transactions of the type where there was no clear law on them. It wasn't like you could say, this is the way you do it. It was ambiguity in a number of things. So I said, this is the way I would do this transaction. And I laid it out, and I talked for about maybe 12 minutes. And all of a sudden, there came a voice over the loudspeaker. And that voice over the loudspeaker said, I don't know what they call that in Chicago, but in New York, we call that malpractice. I'm telling you, these are the words, exact words. They're embedded in my mind. I wouldn't. And I turned to him and I said, excuse me, are you talking to me? And he said, yes, I am. And I said, could you explain yourself? And he said, okay, here's what I would do differently. And then he went through the 7 things that I'd done and said how he would do them differently. And they were all very rational things he'd said, because this, as I say, was an ambiguous area. And then he turned his head and he nodded to me again, which meant, I think it's up to me. So I said, okay, so let me explain why my way of doing it was better than your way. And then I explained that, contrasting his against mine and this risk against that risk. And at that point, he nodded, and I moved on to the second topic. Same thing, like 5 minutes, 6 minutes into the topic, a voice came over the loudspeaker, and the voice said, if you were an associate at Weil, Gotshal and Manges, you would now be looking for a new job. I said, help me out? What's your thought? So he did the same thing, and he went through that. And then I responded to contrast them, and we did that. And when the session ended, after the 2.5 hours, and we were standing up, and we were walking down the stairway, like it was a stairway over on the right, walking down the stairway, Most people were walking out to go to the bathroom, urination time after this 2.5 hours. But about 15 people came running up toward us. And I thought, oh, they're going to kill us. And they came running up toward us, and they made a circle around us. And the first person said, I'm the chairman of the NYU Tax Institute. Would the two of you come and give a speech at the next NYU Tax Institute on whatever topic you'd like to talk about? We'd like to have you. So, man, that sounds good to me. And the second person said, I'm the chairman of the Los Angeles Bar Association's tax section, and we're having a meeting in 2 months, and we'd like you two to be featured speakers.
If my time is running on.
So anyhow, from there on, we started
giving
giving speeches all over the country, and several of them.
Now, would your routine be the same, this sort of point, counterpoint, banging each other? Would that be the pattern?
It would be, but we evolved quickly toward mergers and acquisitions, and as private equity got more and more private equity deals and LBOs, and we moved much more toward the transactional.
So how did the books come about? Briefly.
The chairman of briefly. The chairman of CCH called and asked if two of us would meet with him, Ginsburg and Levine. I said, sure. So we met with him, and he said, I would like CCH, which only had these like 17 volumes, loose leaf volumes with book code and regs and their own commentaries in it. We're going to come out with a series of books that are going to be about substantive issues. We want the two of you to write a book on mergers and acquisitions. And as if there were a single voice, we both answered. And Marty said, yes. And I said, no. And Marty said, what do you mean, no? And I said, Marty, I think you don't understand. The outline we've put together on mergers and acquisitions, because we're now speaking mainly on mergers and acquisitions, that's 160 typewritten pages. Do you know what that's going to be if they put it in print and put it into a book? That's going to be like 35 pages. And their book is going to probably want to be at least, 250 or 500 pages long. So, I mean, and it's going to want, if it's going to be about mergers and acquisitions, we're going to have to start with real simple things. And all we talk about is the unintelligible things, the ones that have no clear answers and how you might work around them. And Marty said, okay, we'll do it. All right. And then the guy said, great. And we'll put out replacement pages to put into the book every year or so. And Marty said, no, time out. It'll be a bound book with a paper cover, like is on the board, like Todd showed. It'll be a paper book, and at the end of every 6 months, not every year, people will throw away that book and we'll print a new book with all the updates and developments in it. And I said, updated every 6 months? And Marty said, yes, we will. Okay, all right.
How important was Marty Ginsburg to you?
Key to the whole success. He and I ended up speaking 36 times at the Hawaii Tax Institute and all over the world. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg came with us, along with my wife, many of those trips and many of those vacations.
Going back a couple pictures, that one on the far right of you two, it looks like you're giving her, she was a justice at that point.
She was justice.
So it looks like you're giving her an award, but what was going on?
Well, I was being given an award by the American Jewish Committee for being a part of the Middle East peace process and a number of other things.
So she's giving you an award.
And so they were going to give me this award in Chicago, my home city, and Marty Ginsburg heard about it. Somebody told him about it. And he said, would you like somebody to present the award? I said, sure, would you like to do that? And he said, no. Would you like Ruth to present the award? And I said, oh, yes. So she presented, they flew to Chicago. She presented the award on that picture, and Marty gave the speech. Usually you have a speaker. Marty said he would be the speaker. So he gave a speech, which was entitled, An Ode to Imperfection. That was a title. I still have the speech at home. And he ran through like 30 minutes of mistakes I made, guffaws. When I was on a radio program once, being interviewed by a University of Chicago professor about how the federal income tax system worked, and he phoned in with a question that was an unanswerable question. And I said, if you were really a client, we would sit down in my office together and I would get out some books and take a look at that, and then I'd be able to advise. Anyhow, so it was a great speech that he gave.
One of the characteristics of these books is he writes your biography in the book and you write his.
Actually, we each wrote our own biography, then we edited each other's biography, which meant a lot of scribbling out and changing words around and putting in new thoughts, yeah.
So, and then the second book, which is 1994, one volume, that you wrote, which is extraordinary 1,000-page book.
Actually,
he was
1,400 pages, but who's counting?
Yes. But he's a special editor, which means what?
He's a special editor, which meant that we had written the first book, the M&A book, which by that time was had moved from being 500 pages to being maybe 750 or 1,000 pages as we redid it every 6 months. And I started teaching a class at University of Chicago Law School, and they asked me to invent something new in the tax area, and I titled my class, Structuring Venture Capital, Private Equity, and Entrepreneurial Transactions. And I taught it without materials for the first year or two. And then I decided, we've got this wonderful book on mergers and acquisitions. I wonder if I could replicate that, but make it aimed at private equity and venture capital. So I sat down for a year, each night and each weekend, and wrote this treatise, scribbled it out, got it typed up. And then Marty Ginsburg said, you better not publish that without my taking a look at it. I said, would you? So I sent it to him, actually chapter by chapter I sent it to him, and he scribbled all over it. He didn't write it, he scribbled all over it. What you're missing, what you should say differently, how. And so then I rewrote it and sent it to him. So I put his name on
as you went through this process of writing the book, which you wrote by hand, as I understand, no typewriter. You used
No, not in those days.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm still not a typist, but I have automatic typewriters.
Was this dynamic at work when you all were exchanging thoughts on each other's chapters and drafts and all the rest, this vigorous intellectual interchange? Was that part of the routine?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. So we would agree on who would write on this new development or this new topic, and that person would write on it, and then we would FedEx it to each other. In those days, there was no internet. FedEx it to each other, and then we engage in lengthy telephone conversations, cussing each other out, and criticizing and going back and forth.
I can't imagine you and Marty Ginsburg arguing over legal points. I can't even fathom. But how do y'all resolve your disagreements?
There was only one time where I couldn't convince him and he couldn't convince me on a very complicated point involving elections as to whether things would be tax-free or taxable, stepped-up basis, not stepped-up basis. And there was an argument going back and forth in which he was arguing one side and I was arguing the other. And it came down to the wire to where he and Ruth Bader Ginsburg were getting on an airplane and going to Europe, and we had to resolve the point within like 3 hours. And so I came up with a concept which said, there's this argument. We each had the arguments we'd written. I said, let's put both arguments in the book. And then down at the bottom and say, and in terms of which of these two approaches is likely to end up being the law, one of the authors says number one, and the other author says number two. And so that was the only one that was written. Now that, ultimately, that was resolved years later when the tax...
When the book first came out, Bickford Eustace, of course, was already in existence. And I gather they decided to review your book and publish a book review. How intimidating is that?
Now, I didn't ask him to do that. I was scared to death if they were going to do that. But CCH asked them to do that. And I was on pins and needles.
This is an advertisement that quotes Eustace. He writes at the bottom, there aren't enough adjectives to describe this book. He was very favorable because your approach was so different from Bitker and Eustace.
Right. So as I talked to them, and afterwards they said, well, look, our book, Bitker and Eustace, is a great book to read if you're a student. It's telling you all about the law, the basic law, the complex law, and all different things, and it's laying it all out. But in your book, you've got to make decisions as to which is right and which is wrong, and you've got to then focus not on just the complex things, but all the non-complex things as well. And so they said, we found your book to be really excellent.
I guess it goes without saying, without Martin Ginsburg, this would not have been as good a book.
It would never have been a book without Martin Ginsburg. He was the driving force.
Yeah.
He was the greatest.
In the last part of this conference or this interview, let's talk about some other subjects. First off, statistics.
Chicago Bears, or what did you have in mind?
Yeah. What is the number of lawyers at Kirkland today that works in the area you started?
Todd, how many do we have working today in our transactional?
600 lawyers, 2,800 of whom work connected to M&A and private equity.
All right, 3,800, 3,600 total lawyers,
2,800 in his area.
2,800 in his area.
2,800 out of 36.
That's extraordinary. How have you handled client risk? Obviously, the fund.
I guess I would say one other thing first quickly. So when we first began, and there was this venture capital, and then it merged into private equity and leveraged buyouts, and things keep getting more and more complicated. It first started out that I was doing them, then I got an assistant, and then a second assistant, and a third. And some of them would be more tax-oriented, and some more SEC-oriented. But we all did the same thing. We did the debt and the equity and the forming of a fund and the acquisitions, et cetera. And as it began to expand, we began to decide that maybe what we should do is have some over here who handle the lending part, because every transaction has borrowed money, the lending part, and over here the SEC part, and over here the environmental part, and over here the fund formation part, and over here the LBO part, et cetera. And so, as Todd was just saying, we branched out, and we now have so many different areas, but that work all together, but with each of them being specialists.
One of the awards that Todd alluded to made a description of you pioneered the use of multidisciplinary legal practice, taking the traditional silos of law firms and blending them into a common endeavor. And I guess that is one of the legacies of your professional career, is that multidisciplinary. But it's the strength, isn't it? It's what kept you from being bored.
I certainly was one of those who went down that path. And yes, I'm glad that I did. I think it turned the practice of law, as well as investing and banking, into a much more entrepreneurial thing. And look at what we have out there as an economy. What is it that makes the U.S. so great? It is the entrepreneurial economy we have. It's the people who are entrepreneurs, who get out of school and they want to go into business or law or some other profession, and they want to invent things, and they want to create things, and they want to take them public, and they want to buy and sell. Now, in the old days, when I started, there was no entrepreneurial economy, as I've said. There was no excitement in the...
So you're making the case that for a tax lawyer, thinking of the boundaries of their discipline loosely is advantageous. Think about taking on negotiation of the deal, drafting the purchase agreement, and not simply being limited by the tax practice.
Yeah. I mean, to me, to be a part of all that...
Otherwise, you get bored, as you've illustrated. Let's talk about client risk for a minute. You've taken on clients that have controversy behind them with respect to over-leverage, laying off employees, bumping up against legal doctrine? How have you managed legal risk in the face of clients who are willing to take a high degree of business risk? How have you avoided that risking you?
Give me more of a hint.
Well, I mean, many people worry about their clients going too far.
So
And yet, you've maintained your integrity and all the rest. So how have you done it?
well, I used to get an easel and draw circles and arrows and tell them, make lists on there of the pros and the cons and the risks. And, you can't guarantee this tax result or this SEC result. And you would try to explain to them. And the clients got smarter and smarter and smarter as they became PhDs in private equity and venture capital and so forth. And so I didn't find it hard as we went along into more and more complex transactions to have them understand the risks they were taking. If you over leverage that much, you're taking a risk of bankruptcy, and here are the risks and so forth.
The related problem with so many clients in the same space, conflicts of interest would seem to be a continuing concern. How have you dealt with the conflicts of interest?
Well, the bar associations have gotten a little bit more broad on that, and you can get waivers from one client that you can work on that client's work and work also on another client's work. Not in the litigation area, that's not something you do as well, but in the transactional area you can do more.
Have you ever had a client separation over your legal fee? Has your legal fee caused clients to quit or you to fire them?
I can remember one or two times when clients were not doing particularly well and slow on paying bills, and you ultimately decided not to continue doing their legal work. But as far as quitting, no, I don't remember.
So when clients get your bill, they're happy and they pay it.
I wouldn't say they were necessarily happy, but they were willing to pay.
All right. Let's end the.
When they get the expertise of somebody like Todd Baines, they're gonna pay.
Let's end this interview this way, which of course has been a wonderful hour. Let me cover this. Here's a couple of dudes from Chicago. I guess you've had a long friendship with him.
Yes, even before he was president of the United States, he was on the Harvard Law Review,
Right.
and many years behind me. And when he came to Chicago to practice law, he looked around for others who had been on the Harvard Law Review and lived in Chicago. So he looked me up. And so, hi, this is Barack Obama calling. I was on the Harvard Law Review. Would you like to have lunch, kind of thing?
So
Yeah,
y'all made,
sure.
we don't have time to
So
go through it.
we got to be good friends. And then when he decided to run for office, I held fundraisers for him. And
Well, I think you Harvard guys need to look out for yourself.
Yeah.
All right. So your hobby takes us to snow skiing.
Yes.
You're a snow skier, an enthusiastic snow skier.
I used to be a mediocre but reasonably good tennis player, but the back got the better of me. But skiing is still good. I became a skier at age 32. And once I became a skier, I began to invite private equity people to ski over the weekend, and
Right.
we developed something called the Kirkland Ski
All right,
League.
so this is the ranking of the slopes from the Ski Association that I downloaded. Green, blue, black diamond, and double black. Where do you fall on that?
About halfway between black diamond and double black diamond.
You're awesome. All right. Now, the second dimension to skiing is vertical drop. You've educated me about this. What is your vertical drop?
Well, the most vertical feet I ever skied in a single day until this past winter was 1,700 vertical. 17,000 vertical feet. And this winter, feeling not as good as I used to, I thought, I better give it a harder try because I may never get another good winter in. And so 5 days in a row, I skied more than 20,000 vertical feet, the highest being 25,500 vertical feet.
All right. You're making me feel so inadequate. All right. Now, with this right here, I'm going to ask you a question that is a very loaded question. Let's just assume for the moment that I'm a Texas billionaire who wants to hire you to create an equity fund for me.
Okay.
And let's just assume I would insist on your personal involvement along with Kirkland Supports. What would you charge me to do that legal work?
Per hour?
I don't care, the whole thing. Just give me a number, whatever
I'll give you
framework.
the per hour and the whole thing.
Fine, whatever. I just want to know, what would I have to do to pay you enough money to let me have your services? Oh, Lordy. Thank you, Jack, so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, brother.
Thank you.